Welcome, everybody, to Machine Learning for Access to Justice, Digital Legal Needs, plus Analysis and Tools. That's a mouthful. I'm David Colarusso from Suffolk University. I am Director of the Legal Innovation and Tech Lab there. I'll let the other speakers introduce themselves. I don't know if that mic's on.
Sure.
All right.
Hi, everyone. I'm Margaret Hagan. I am the Director of the Legal Design Lab at Stanford Law School.
And I'm Lester Bird with the Pew Charitable Trust Civil Legal Modernization Project.
All right, so first I'm going to lay out a quick roadmap of what we're going to cover today. We don't want folks who have seen us talk before think they're seeing the same presentation, although you might feel like the first 5 minutes are the same presentation because we want to get everyone to the same spot. That might be a joke. Because it's, okay, well. We want to frame this, and the part that's sort of be the same for a bunch of people is talking about two projects, Learned Hands and Spot, which we'll get into in one. Then we're going to talk specifically about NISME version 2 and how that's getting built and where that is in its development. Then we're going to talk about Spot, which is, these words will make sense to you after that first bullet point, which is a machine learning classifier. Then we're going to talk about sort of the role of this community and other communities in helping direct those and shepherd them along to do cool things. And then that will lead into an actual public, a little discussion here. All right, so access to justice crisis, we all know there's one. We try to use tech to solve it. Sometimes that looks like sort of lawyer for the day, sort of limited representation stuff on the web. Sometimes it looks like sort of either legal service portals or getting help using a natural language on a website. Sometimes it's, other normal sort of standard self-help materials on a website. Okay. So, is this, do you want to, when do you want to pop in?
Me, but you're good.
I blew through you. We did not coordinate that handoff as well. I thought it was this slide we were going for. The different approaches to things that we can see using technology for. We want to be very careful, though, around the notion that just because we can do something, we should do something. So you probably noticed the first thing here is sort of maximizing benefits, minimizing harms. I know there was one person who may or may not be in the audience who just wants to focus on the minimizing harms, but and thinks that everything will follow. And I think that's not bad, but maximizing benefits as well. And so how do we make sure that we build good things, right? We're going to talk about a couple of projects. Spot is a classifier, which means you give it text, it gives you back an issue, and then we're hoping that that can be leveraged by people to do cool things. Everyone remember, this is my slide that everyone sees. These tools produce models. All models are wrong, but some are useful, which means that you always need to think, since it's wrong, you never want the model's output to end conversation, it should always start the conversation. You always have to ask compared to what. So if you're not providing something that's usually an easy bar to clear, that first one, you can also sort of read into that, of course, do no harm. So we want to think about those things. Spot runs upon Learned Hands, which is a project that came about when we were all saying, it was actually here at TIG about 2 years ago. I'm going really fast because I don't want to be up here too long. We were out in a hallway conversation, Margaret and I, and she was talking about the taxonomy she was working on, and someone from Microsoft walked by and they were talking about a machine learning classifier they were working on, and someone had talked about some stuff they'd been doing with Reddit, and we said, hey, and it just all came together. There's an access to justice problem. Machine learning seems like it could be useful to do something, and a lot of people a lot of attorneys want to help somehow, but they didn't know how. So we created a project called Learned Hands. Some of you, at least 41 of you, maybe not in this room, got the email that went out on Friday last asking people to play Learned Hands as a game, and I'll be mentioning something about it again before the rapid fire talks later. But it is a tool that allows many hands to make light work. And so the idea is what you're doing is it's a game which allows you to look at lay people's legal texts, to label them with the NSMI, which will all be made more clear soon, and then that can be used as training data for something like Spot. And this group, the LSC TIG group, the ITC group, has now donated over 20 hours since Friday labeling. So well done, group. We can do more. Okay, this is the NSMI is of course the thing we use to label, and Learned Hands is a game that you can play, and that's there. And we'll Again, this is the speed. So now that that was the stuff everyone has seen before, let's get into where we're at.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks. So, taxonomies, woohoo! Who here knows what a taxonomy is? Pretty good. Who here is uncomfortable with that word or not too much discomfort? The main part of this part of the giant ecosystem that we're going to be talking about today, about classifiers, taxonomies, and possibly using machine learning for access to justice, is just about making a giant list of the problems that people have in the US context that have a possible legal remedy or solution. So we're really focused on making this taxonomy, otherwise known as a giant list of names of these issues and standard codes for each of the issues that list out the kind of most on-the-ground problem scenarios that people experience and then might go on Reddit or Philadelphia Legal Assistance or a self-help site and say, I am experiencing this situation. I think it might have a legal issue. What is that issue called? What is that remedy I might use? So this is not the first time that anyone has tried to make a giant list of legal issues, but it is the first time that it's focused really on people's on-the-ground scenarios. In the past, legal issues have been listed out, including from a wonderful project from the 2000s that was benefited or led in part by LSC called National Subject Matter Index version 1, which was really aimed at legal aid experts and how they would encode what they were working on. So it was a kind of mixed list of issues that people experienced, this kind of on-the-ground scenarios, along with the remedies that the legal aid lawyers knew that person might have, like a certain statute or a certain name of a immigration program or something like that, kind of more the expert knowledge about what you could do if you had that on-the-ground scenario. Plus, that list had lots about legal operations, like how to get funding or how to manage your website. It was kind of a giant list of things that legal aid lawyers worked on. So that list is great, and we borrowed from that list of the original National Subject Matter Index, NSME. But we also realized it was kind of unwieldy for our use case, which was more about machine learning, chatbot builders, website and portal makers who wanted that kind of standard list of legal issue codes, especially when it was a person coming on a website or typing into a chatbot and talking about their problems. So not so much from the legal expert's point of view about relief or how they run their nonprofit, and more really on the ground lists of stories that people tell and the kind of issues that might be present. So over the past 2 years, we have been really trying to streamline and borrow from that original National Subject Matter Index and also review it with all different kinds of sources to make that cleaner list that's more focused and hopefully more usable for the machine learning purposes and other kind of tech and web developer purposes. So we started with that wonderful list of NSME terms, which was in the tens of thousands. And like I showed, we printed it all out and categorized and did a lot of card sorting. We removed a lot of terms that don't apply to people's lived experiences, all those operational terms or legal remedy terms. And we also pulled in a lot of other groups' taxonomies, including some from legal aid reps in the audience, people who had been building their own taxonomies, whether from Illinois or Maine or from tech companies. So we kind of checked, is this taxonomy that was built in the early 2000s, is it still relevant to legal aid groups right now? What are all those other terms? And now for the past year, we've been doing a lot of review. So we've been reviewing that giant list, both against site architectures of all your wonderful states' law help portals and how you categorize legal information and the words that you use for that. We've been doing it with in-person interviews and sessions and kind of redlining with subject matter experts from legal aid and legal aid technologist communities. And we've also been reviewing it against the giant corpus that we have of Reddit posts of 75,000 stories, or 70,000 some stories, of people on Reddit and the kinds of issues they're bringing up to see, are what people talking about in Reddit is that actually being represented in this giant expert source list of terms. So that means we're progressively finalizing this new version 2 of a giant list. We finalized the parent level, the top level. We finalized-ish the child level 1, the first level of subcategories underneath the high levels. And then we'll be moving on to child 2 and child 3 in this coming year. What that's looked like, so we scraped all of the law help portals across the country, all of the 50 states law help portals, and saw how they were organizing their information, what the top level categories and sitemaps were, and we could then check if we had similar representations and terms in our taxonomy. There was a lot of standardization that was really helpful. We narrowed it down to 20 parent categories at the top level. And I'll send you the link, and you can please feel free to review and check it out. So those are really high-level categories like family issues, housing issues, disaster relief issues, government services issues. And those are the labels that will come in handy when we talk about Learned Hands and Spot, about spotting issues at that very high level. We've then gone to the child level 1. So that's one level down from those high-level family or housing to the 5 to 25 major subcategories within each of those parents. So these are like within family law, for example, issues around adoption, issues around child custody, issues around divorce, issues around paternity. So still not like the specific scenario that a person has in detail, but getting towards a more specific term to capture what's going on in a person's story. And we've put those on Learned Hands, so people are now reading people's stories on Reddit and saying, yes, there seems to be an adoption issue in the story, or one with paternity. So one of our goals in making this new giant list of terms is that you guys will use it, especially those of you who are building chatbots, websites, portals, or other things where you can be referring from site to chatbot or across things. If we have a standard list of terms, hopefully we can have a much more interoperable network of resources online. So one of the factors that we're really prioritizing is cross-listing, because we see in people's stories that oftentimes it's not clear that their story corresponds just to family law, or just to debt and consumer issues, or just to estate planning. Surprise, surprise, there's lots of overlap and blurriness, especially at this kind of first 1 to 3 paragraphs that people put out about their stories. So we've made it possible both for a single term, a single kind of problem scenario to be cross-listed, and also that a single post from Reddit could have multiple terms applied to it to kind of recognize how messy or interrelated issues are. We also know that it's really important for those of you who have invested in previous taxonomies, a la National Subject Matter Index or your own taxonomy, that if you do want to make use of this new standard, that it's easy for you to do so. So we are building our new taxonomy website with a database set up that allows for this mapping. And I'll pull David in a little bit here. We have plans to use what we'll talk about in the next session, next section, the Spot classifier, to hopefully make that taxonomy mapping a little bit more user-friendly and efficient. David, do you want to say a few words about the planning there?
Yeah, so the plan just is there that if you have a taxonomy, we will help facilitate your mapping of that taxonomy by doing a very simple, you can give the taxonomy, it'll do a simple then similarity search to the NISME taxonomy and give you its best guess of the mapping. So it'll do a first pass, which then you can go in. So if you only have a dozen or so issues, then maybe that's not the tool you need to use. You can just do it manually. But if you, for example, the main thing is this tool will be used to help us do a backwards compatibility mapping with NISME version 1. And then that will actually not just be the first pass. I believe Margaret's RAs are committed to help make that mapping finalized. So, but that tool will be available for anyone with an idiosyncratic issue set to be able to do the first pass of the mapping just to make it a little easier. And as my son was always like, why is Toy Story 1 not called Toy Story 1? Well, NISME was just NISME. And then there was a sequel. So if you're looking for NISME 1, you're not going to find it out there. It's at NISME and then NISME version 2, just like Toy Story.
Yeah, and we're happy to talk about this more in questions or afterwards if you are thinking about that mapping. And then the other thing we're trying with this taxonomy is really to be iterative and ongoing, building new terms in, new issues. I mean, even as we're seeing with Reddit, there's lots of issues that people are experiencing that are not captured in the taxonomies from the 2000s or even the past 10 years. There's new kinds of situations people are having and have possible legal remedies for. So we have these first drafts. We are very open to your edits and comments. So especially if you want to add or rephrase or add more context into what we have currently, the website that I'll share the link to, our demo site of our new taxonomy website, has a very easy edit, propose edit, or make suggestions or propose new links feature. So we want as much of your input as possible to make this an ongoing iterative project. So like I said, so we have a current version of all of the terms, the parent and child level 1. If you search NISME version 2, it's hosted at LSNTAP's website, which also hosts NISME version 1. So just search LSNTAP NISME version 2, and you can see all of the terms that we have in this finalized list. We're building this new website that will be more interactive and open to editing, mapping, et cetera, the other features. So one of the features of the new website to make it more usable is not just to list out the term itself and the definition and the code, but also to pull in what we're learning from the Learned Hands project, from Reddit and other public data sets. So that when you look up a term like the term adoption, you can actually see real people's stories about that term, how people talk about it, what phrases are common for expressing that. So balancing the kind of more legal term, the more expert term, with the actual words that folks use when they're discussing it. And this takes me to a really interesting way that we've been reviewing the taxonomy, which is exploring how folks on Reddit talk about the terms that we as lawyers have certain words for. David, do you want to just talk a little bit about the topic modeling tool that you built?
Yeah, but first I'll pivot though and talk about how Reddit's not enough. And we've talked about this in previous sessions. The Reddit corpus is the corpus that we use to get things going because it was people posting to a place that calls itself the front page of the internet. We spoke with the moderators of that particular forum, and they were actually the ones who provided the text for us. And part of their rules on the forum is to help remove any personally identifying information during the post. So it provided a data set that we felt comfortable being able to share out with people to do the labeling that we're doing in Learned Hands. And so it's the data set we have available to us to do some of these big data approaches, but we're always looking for other data sets. And so we've just secured, I think we have maybe one or two other data sets. It's been a lot harder to get data sets than you would think. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, Reddit folks don't talk like my population, then talk to us, and if you have data on your population, then that can be very helpful. But what this is just some latent topic modeling, which is that basically it goes through in this case, the Reddit corpus, and it looks not for how are you talking about housing or how are you talking about this. It looks for how do people talk about things in the same way. And it finds clusters of common language that you can then go in and explore and say, well, what are all these things? What do they have in common? And then that's where you can say, oh, well, these look like housing issues, or these look like this. And then you can drill down to all the ones that you thought were housing, and you can say, oh, they're clumped together again. All the things in this housing clump are clumped together in these different ways. People talk about this issue in these 5 different ways. Oh, those look like these 5 issues. And very important to understand, this is not determinative. It's not saying because we see these things we're going to make a NISME issue. It's just a check to say, hey, does the NISME issue that's been talked about with experts and stuff, did they catch everything that's in this? And then there are other ways that we can say, do we catch things that weren't here? But this might, one of the problems that surfaces that you see in Reddit, for example, are, not quite sure how to, sextortion is something that comes up, right? So,
a lot about pets too.
A lot about pets. But I was trying to think of things that you might not normally see, right? The notion that someone's been in a texting relationship with someone and then something happens and then someone's being extorted, right? So that's not something that you would have normally, maybe that's not something you see in your practice, but that's something that's in this data set that but for looking at this, we might have missed. There are other things that you see in your practice that, but for talking to experts, we would have missed. And that's why the feedback mechanism is so important.
So David built this wonderful tool for us, and you can play around with it, I think, on the Learned Hands GitHub site.
It's on the Learned Hands GitHub site.
Which we can share if you want to play around too, because it's really fun. There's all of these big bubbles of just organic clusters of what the classifier or what the model sees as possible issue areas. So then myself and my team of RAs would get around, have lunch, and then click on each of those bubbles and say, what are the words within this giant bubble? What is going on here? And then we've tried to kind of backtrack and figure out, all right, there's this giant bubble. What are the actual words inside of it? Either 1 to 3 phrase words. And then we tried to kind of go from the words to some kind of issue or scenario on the ground. So for example, when we used the family-oriented classifier, we were getting a big bubble that would talk about dogs, being drunk, being assaulted, police, help, family, mother. And then we put a label on it that's where we were guessing. This seems to be about violence, abuse, and restraining orders, from what we could tell from the word clusters. So in each of those big bubbles, you can play around, and you can probably get around 50 to 100 words that are going on inside that big cluster. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what is going on in these similar clusters of stories on Reddit, and what is a legal issue or a problem scenario that we can put as a label on top of this. And this was a way to then go back to our expert taxonomy and say, does this term exist in our expert things, or are we missing things? We can't say that these clusters are the most important, but it does show us some distinct scenarios that are common among the Reddit population. That was a really helpful way to review, and this is something that we can do even more of as the classifiers get stronger, to see are the issues that are really a priority, at least for this demographic on this platform. Like in housing, the main issues were around homeowner issues, issues when renting a home, ending a landlord and tenant relationship and getting your deposit back, and then problems with neighbors and living conditions. So it actually corresponds pretty well to our original taxonomy. The other thing that this helped us to do was to get these lists of people's terms that correspond to a legal term. Like, for example, in that abuse and restraining orders section, we found a lot of terms related to pets or abuse of pets, as well as suicide and other things. These are phrases that potentially, as developers or other people are building improved search or improved responses to people's stories, that they can have this glossary of keywords that relates to a legal term code, and potentially use that to better screen people for the legal issue they might be having, even if they're talking without using that official legal term. And as the classifiers improve, we hope that we can use this to look back at Reddit and other data sets and find what patterns of legal issues people have, to see where there might be the most frequent issue areas on a certain platform, a certain demographic area, and also see if there are patterns of commonly overlapping issues or sequences of issues. If you're interested in this, I'm very happy to talk more, but I think I'll call that, I won't talk any more about the taxonomy. There is a staging site, so it is a prototype. It might break a few times, but you can definitely explore. It's at https://taxo-dev.herokuapp.com. So you can see the same things that it's on LSNTAP's version 2, which is a more stable site, NISME version 2. But here you can start to see how we're planning for the mapping of taxonomies and the editing. So if you want to come on, leave comments and edit, we welcome you to come visit. All right, we can save questions for later. If you do have questions about taxonomy, we'll save those till the end. Here we go.
All right, so just to sort of draw back to the roadmap here, to sort of make explicit something that I think I was only implicit about in the introduction. I had expressed that I wanted to make sure everyone was on the same level, and if you heard us talk about stuff before, I think you've got it, but I want to make sure for new faces. The important thing here with NISME, and so why does this all tie in to AI, is you need, if you're going to have, in this case we're talking about AI, which is machine learning, which is just statistics, which is basically finding patterns, in this case in natural language, that correspond to what we're calling issues here. And these are the NISME issues particularly. So you have to have a list of things that you are trying to say this is like these things. And NISME is that list. So it's very important that the NISME list take in your input, because if we talk about sort of the three main ways that something could go wrong with a classifier, it would be we're not looking for all of the issues, right? So that would be sort of the easiest thing, to have some missing data where there's an issue that's one population experiences, but it's not represented here. And if it's not represented, then there's no way the classifier can have anything to say against it, about it. So that's very important that we get your input to build that out to make it as robust as it can be. The other one, in which I'll sort of get into with SPOT, is if we are confident in our issues, then we have to be confident that our tool is spotting all the diversity of ways that people might talk about those issues. And that then comes again to NISME is really about sort of the diversity of the issues and making that as complete as possible. And SPOT, its training data, is going to have texts that have the NISME labels on them. So it says this text has these 3 issues in it, or these 5 issues, or this one issue. And we need to make sure that that training data is representative of the way people actually talk. Because if there's a way that, say there's an idiomatic way that one population talks about an issue, and it's not in your training data, then SPOT's not going to be able to recognize that. So let's talk about SPOT. So how we learn. So SPOT is now in very early beta. So let's see, do I put the, yeah, there we go. There's the URL. So any of you who are developers in the room, you actually can go there, you can create a developer account, you'll get an API key, and you actually can start playing with SPOT as it exists now. For those of you who aren't familiar with what an API is, it's just basically sort of a structured way for computer programs to speak to each other. And so basically SPOT says, if you give me a string of text, I will shoot back a list of the issues I think are in that text. And again, I want to sort of make clear about the issues. Margaret was talking about sort of issues with potential legal remedies. And this gets tough because of the way attorneys use the term of art issues, is when we're talking about NISME, the potential part's really important, because you could have one jurisdiction where there is a legal remedy to something your landlord's doing, and another jurisdiction where the landlord can be just as much a jerk and there's not a legal remedy. Okay? I didn't mean to make all landlords sound bad, but I mean, I was a landlord. Okay. I was a public defender. I'm always the little guy. It's the, anyhow. So the point is, that's how SPOT works. It's a structured way for computer programs to speak to each other. So if you go here and you're a developer, you can sort of dive into that. If you're not a developer, you can read sort of all about what we're doing. But there's very sort of robust documentation for developers. So I'm just going to take a moment to sort of, we'll see if I can open up here. Margaret told me that all of her tabs were fine for everyone to, and we'll see if we're actually connected to the.
Internet connection might be the problem.
All right, well then I'll get back to, where was our presentation? I was good to.
All the way across. Maybe swipe all the way across.
Yep.
No.
No?
It's just New York Times. It's nothing bad. It's nothing
I did
bad.
ask. I asked before.
There's nothing bad. It's on this tab, but
right,
I don't know
so
what
minimize
got
the-
happened.
Yeah.
And
I'll just go
then-
back to there then.
No, it's this one.
That one. Okay.
It's all good.
All right. Just maximize that again.
Maximize. I can do this. There we
Yeah.
go.
All right, so of course I knew that live demos are always a problem, so I did have a second set of slides in here that does give me some more look at the documentation. I had hoped to be able to scroll. But what you'll see there is if you go, this is just a Swagger documentation for the API. It's a RESTful API. This talks about the different endpoints here and the information that you can get. Basically, you can throw it text, and then it gives you back the results. The thing that we're so here's an example of a call to the API, and you have to send it a couple different things. Obviously, you have to send it the text that you want to be classified. And then this is a very, very important one, whether or not you want us to save the text. And you have to actually affirmatively say yes or no. There's no default. So as a developer, you actually have to make a determination as to what you want to do, and we can talk about reasonable defaults in our next bullet point. But you have to make an affirmative choice. And if you let us save it, then we're going to use that to help improve the algorithm. And we're going to share that. We're not going to sell it. We can talk about all those constraints again at the next bullet point. But that's an important choice you have to make as a developer. You can also push that to your end user. So you could, in your so the four main ways you could end up using Spot is you could send us text and not let us save any of the information. Just have it long enough to send you back the results. You could send us text, have us save the information. Or you could have the user decide, and that would be sort of if you decided what to do, or you could have the user decide and you could have the user opt in or opt out to save that information. And that's because we recognize that there are use cases where you're just not going to want to share that information. But we also are hopeful that enough people will think there are use cases where you can share that information, or at least push it to the end user to share, because that text is going to benefit other users in similar circumstances. And this is really important because, remember, the spot here was how we learn, and my preface was we need a diverse set of training data in order to address things. And so there's no better training data than real data from real clients. So the idea is that the Reddit data and the other data sources we have get us something that's good enough to get it in front of real people. Now, the nice thing is the Reddit questions are real people's real questions. It's just that population may be different than your population. But get it in front of your population. Get your population's questions. And then using the API, one of the other things you can do is after you get the results back, you can pass back what action they actually took. And then that can be used to train to say, hey, this actually was a housing issue, so please treat it as similar ones in the future as such. And this really comes down to the developers to sort of think cleverly about this. I don't know how many people were in the previous session, but I really like the Massachusetts approach. And what they're using Spot for is they've built they're building a portal which uses Spot as one way to find what issues are there. But they also then do just a standard text search through their resources. And so what they end up having is in the back end, it's like two votes. They say, someone says, I got kicked out, whatever. And so if that's in their text, the body of their resources, that will come up in their search, but then it would also come up in Spot. And so you can say, oh, they both agree, great, we know that's that. Then they click on, I want, and it says, oh, we think you have a housing issue, is that right? Then you say yes, and that information can go back to us and say, yes, this was a housing issue. But you can imagine a scenario where Spot doesn't do too well and doesn't return a result, but it finds it in the search. And then that saying, this is a housing issue, goes back and says, hey, you have a blind spot here, fix that. And so that approach of taking this, integrating it into your tools, having it be as powerful as it is at a certain time, and then allowing it to grow, and then grow in what it can do, is really the way we've designed this, which is why you have these then additional things you can pass it. So you can say, so when Spot returns a result, it's going to say, you have this issue, we're X% sure that this issue is present, and we have error bars on top of it up to what percentage and down to what percentage. So you might come back and say, it would say, we think there's like a 45 to a 75% chance there's a housing issue in here. And then you your developers or you as a user of the API can decide what is your threshold. So if you're really worried about false positives, you'll set one threshold. If you're really worried about false negatives, you'll set another. So to make that concrete, I'm really worried maybe, say, about missing someone's issue. Well, then I'm going to set that threshold lower so that I make sure that I get the issue. Or maybe the thing I'm really worried about is saying someone has an issue when they don't actually have an issue and then somehow souring that relationship. Well, then I'm going to set the threshold a different place. Or maybe there are some issues that I really care one way about and some issues I don't care another way about. And so you might even set different threshold for different issue types. But the API provides you that flexibility, and we're very transparent about our confidence in the answer. So that being said, what are we confident about? So if you go to the Spot website and you look at performance, you'll see there a list. There's the NISME version 2, the parent levels. If I had an actual connection to the internet, I would click on them. Maybe some of you have internet. We're above the basement, so you can turn off the Wi-Fi and maybe your data will work. But you could click on those, and what it'll do is it'll expand and show you the child issues. The issues that are in yellow are the ones that we're calling active labels, which is to say Spot will actually return an actual estimate of what's there. So right now, if you put in something that was maybe benefits, Spot would return back a benefits, but it would say the confidence we had was between 0 and 100% that chance there's a benefits question there, which is true, but not very useful. Okay? But for all those ones that are yellow, we're actually going to give you something that's not between 0 and 100. We'll say something, between 25 and 95 or whatever. And as time goes by, those error bars are going to shrink. And as time goes by, the coverage is going to grow. So how do we choose which one of these are yellow and which one of them are not? We basically are training the model primarily through data from learned hands. When we train a model, we always, and this is where I got to level set and remember my audience again. When we're evaluating the model, we'll take a bunch of data. We'll take the labeled data, say from learned hands. We'll take 20% of that, push it off to the side. Then we'll train our model on the remaining 80%. And then once we have a model, we'll look at that 20% and say, how did we do? Right? How is our model doing? And so when we find that our model is better than a coin flip, or better than the naive guess of always guessing yes or no, then we say the model will activate that label and we'll allow it to return results. And why always guessing yes or always guessing no? We'll just think about it this way. This is what I do with my students. Let's say we're going to build an app that's going to predict whether or not school is going to be closed due to weather. If I build an app that says no, I'm going to be right 98% of the time because we don't close very often because we're in Boston and we'll put up with it. Thank you. But that's a statement about how accuracy is not the metric that you always want to use. So we also, another thing that you can get from the API is you can get statements about and this either will or won't, other metrics for the model. So we'll give you the precision, the recall, the F1 score. We will give you the accuracy as it performed on our test data. So you can use that information to know whether or not you trust this label enough to use. So Massachusetts, for example, they've set their threshold at a certain point, and until it gets there, it's not going to be using Spot to help do that issue spotting. So we're really trying to give you that granular level of control to say, I really care about false positives, I don't care about false positives. Figure out your use case and then use it appropriately. So how is it doing? Well, this is where I would again do a live demo, but sorry. Imagine I click on this and then I could put stuff in here. This is an example of a very simple demonstration we built on top of the Spot tool. You, of course, could go to Spot if you sign up for an account and then you talk to me. Then I can verify you as a nonprofit user because we are offering this free to all nonprofits and LSC. And so let me be clear, I'm at a law school, we're a nonprofit, we're funded by Pew, which is, well, not the entire law school, this project, to make it available free to LSC grantees and similarly situated folks. So you can go in and then I can give you full access. Then you would actually have a tool like this that you could do. So that's another thing is one of the back ends, we allow you to do QC. Eventually what you'll be able to do is see those, if you allowed us to save the information, see those queries that came through on your use of the API, and then you can say, yes, we got it right, or no, we didn't get it right. And that becomes an additional way to send information, not just the user feedback from they took this path or that path. But the idea is here, you could put in some information. You can see how we've built in some of the, we have down there an opt-out for use my reply to help people facing similar issues. You might have a use case that decides that's an opt-in or you don't give people the option. All right, so that's that. And now this comes to how do we use this all, and now Lester.
All right, if you thought taxonomy talk was interesting, wait until a non-lawyer talks about terms of service. You guys are going to get it. So David referenced earlier, one of the things we did last year at this conference and before was start going around and asking people to share data sets. And we had very limited success with that. We had a couple of private data sets that got shared with the project as well as the Reddit data, but we weren't getting other data sources. And so we started to say, well, why is that? What's going on here? Why aren't people sharing this information with us? This is a great public good project, like what's up? So what we found out from talking to folks was people really didn't know if they had permission to be sharing the data that they were sitting on. Either it was client confidential, where they definitely didn't think they had the permission to do it, or they hadn't asked the person if they could share it, therefore the default position was, no, we don't want to share this information. And so we were thinking about Spot, and we said, well, as we build out this tool, one of the things we want to be able to do is share back with the community the data that we're receiving so other people can build tools off of this data set and not go through the same struggles we're going through. But how do we do that? And so one of the things we're going to do going forwards, and lucky for us, we have a grantee who will allow us to try this out, is we're going to document the process of creating a terms of service for Spot. And we're going to start looking at the questions that we're asking ourselves as we go through it. You know, are you collecting private information? What do you want to do with it? And from those terms of service, we then want to map that out to what are we telling users who are navigating this tool? What are the short little sentences that we can give them to say, this is what we're doing and this is what we're doing with your information if you share it with us. Or if you don't share it with us, this is the blurb that we'll give you about how we're not sharing this information. So we're really hopeful that going through this process with Spot, we can build out over the course of the next year a replicable model for other organizations to start going through, looking through a guided interview to start asking these same sort of questions and really build out a more a community based around privacy and asking these sort of questions. And David, is there anything that you want to contribute from Suffolk's perspective?
So the other thing I would add is, as we move away sort of some of your traditional thoughts of what's in terms of service, we also want to think about reasonable use constraints. So obviously, the terms of service will deal with things like California's new privacy law, all the sort of things we normally think about as attorneys. But as attorneys, one of the things we should think about is that there are legal remedies to some of the problems we think are hard that aren't technical remedies. So we want to play with the idea of maybe we should put constraints on how people can use the API. So a very simple one might be only nonprofits, right? Maybe that's enough of an alignment of incentives. But what we want to do is prevent the situation where someone takes the API and uses it to target the populations we're trying to serve for something that is going to be detrimental to them. So you could imagine someone taking the API and looking at a forum online and finding all the people they thought were in a vulnerable situation and then preying upon them in some way, right? So, payday lenders. You can think of 100 different ways that someone might take this and use it in a way that would undermine the entire purpose of this, which is try to help people with their problems. And so I think the important thing to remember as attorneys is that the solutions to those problems are not always technical solutions, right? So sometimes they are legal solutions. So to the extent that someone is using the API, is entering into an agreement with us, we have the power to help set some standards. And so that's one of the other things we want to explore, and what do those look like? And that's sort of the open conversation I think we're all about to have. So, Margaret, do you want to add anything to any of that? And I already saw someone's hand moving. So we've been instructed, since we're being broadcast, to walk around with we were instructed to repeat the question, but I like walking. So, so did I see a hand? So let's frame this a little better. So now I guess we'll advance. Okay, so now, there we go. And there you also have those, some URLs that you might find useful. And everyone should also play Learned Hands. I'm going to say this again later today to everyone, but because it'll make things better. All right, I see a young woman in the back has a question.
I would just like to advocate for not limiting it to nonprofits. I think that for-profit organizations that are built around helping people are some of our more sustainable models that are out there. So if we disincentivize this is the most sustainable models that we have from using it, I think we're going to hamstring ourselves.
So I actually agree with that. We have funding to provide it for free to nonprofits. So if we wanted to, which I think is correct, to allow for-profit use, then there has to be a way to figure out who's going to pay for it. But since they're for-profits, there's probably a way to do that. And then I think the question is, then it's what are the incentives we want to align with? So do we make it so that you can only use it? How do we classify? This is great because we're all lawyers. How do we determine what are those things
Not all
that...
of us.
Well, that's true. We're all within the legal community, working with people facing legal problems. And actually this is something we should talk more about because we do want to talk about how this could be used in sort of social service scenarios as well. So you could imagine this being all this work, the NISME as classifying issues and then as being able to spot them. You could do a thing where someone's they call up, the phone call gets transcribed, they're speaking to someone, a social service advocate of some type. They're going to provide them with their normal social service intake. And then they notice, hey, these 5 issues have triggered. Oh, well, you know what? You might want to think about contacting an attorney about these. Let me provide you with some information there. So you can think of a lot of, I don't want people to think that these things are, because a lot of the context this gets put in is portal projects, because that's the thing that's concrete to everyone right now, because that's what people are working on. But you could imagine taking something like Spot and pointing it at the narrative sections of small claims court filings and saying, what are the issues that are really before the court? So you can think of all sorts of different ways. You could think about it as your service provider. You get cold emails in. You don't know really what they're all about. You throw them in and you can see, oh, well, we see seasonality. Right, everyone's going to see housing issues spark around in September 1 or whatever. But you might find things that you didn't expect. So there are a lot of uses here that we can think about. But to the terms of service point, maybe the constraint is just like if you're a for-profit and you're using this, don't pretend you're a person when you're not a person. Right? Like I don't know what those are, but that's a conversation we're going to have. So and please say who you are.
Jeff Cox with Unicourt. One of the questions I had is, what other data sets are you interested in, and how will your classifiers handle those new data sets?
I think that's a 2-part question. So there's data sets that would be useful for NISME, so I'll let Margaret answer that first.
Yes, so I think our first pass is on things similar to Reddit. Knowing that the classifiers have been built on this. And what we're seeing, we at Stanford, our lab, separate from the public-facing Learned Hands project, have been gathering data sets from those who run statewide portals and have intake lines or live chat lines, or we've been working with the ABA and their free legal answer virtual clinic, where we similarly have people coming onto a platform talking about their problems, probably for the first time or second time, but giving a short several paragraph narrative about what's going on in their life. So I think this is our first kind of section of data sets, is this like person going on, talking about what they're experiencing and asking, do I have a legal issue? So hopefully we'll get the classifiers to be working very well at this kind of intake level self-described narrative. That's our first group. If you do have data sets in that area, if you have an intake line, chat line, or hotline with text, we'd love to talk to you about how we might get a wider set of data.
And can you talk about how they could then put that on Learned Hands in a way that wouldn't be visible to everyone?
Yeah, so the way that we've set up Learned Hands, which if you haven't gone to the game, is a place where you can read people's stories and then say, there is a family law issue here, or there's not a family law issue here. We've set up private forks of that. So if you go on that link, you'll see the public-facing site that anyone can log on to and read Reddit posts that are anonymized and kind of safe for public viewing. We have private forks of the site so that only pre-approved users, like my research assistants, can see private data sets and then do the similar kind of labeling, but in a private way that's all on our servers and segmented off. So that's when there is privacy concerns, or there hasn't been consent in a terms of service to show things public, or we're concerned about or confidential info, we can have this kind of more private labeling. And then that labeled data is kind of, again, segmented off. So if there are privacy concerns or anonymization concerns, we can work with that. One of the big goals is that we can have a smarter public-facing classifier. The Reddit data has been really useful for that. So this is just the kind of general governance questions about how we can have terms of service that allow feeding into a more public knowledge base, and also anonymization and other preventative concerns to prevent any kind of public or personal data going public.
Yeah, and I think building off of what David just said earlier and what Margaret just said then, we're interested in not just typical legal intake data sets, but like, are there other data sets that exist where there's people who have legal problems accompanying something else? You know, if you're calling a hotline for food insecurity issues, are there accompanying legal issues that we might be able to pull out of that? And from there, can we see Spot getting into these other areas where we can start to really address that gap where people don't know they have legal problems or they don't know they have legal remedies to the problems that they're facing. And that's where we really see the real growth for this tool and potential for it. I think, you know, there's a utility obviously within the legal space. There's a great utility for it, but there's also utility outside of the legal space. And that's one of our big interests over the course of the next year.
I'll just add on with an example. So our lab has partnered with Empower Work. If you haven't looked it up, you should look it up. It's a chat line. If you know crisis text line, it's similar to that. It's a nonprofit social enterprise where they chat with people about problems at work. Bosses, coworkers. It's not a legal line, but they have these long transcripts of live volunteers with people who are having issues at work to deal with mental health and job negotiations, all kinds of things. So they've given us their chat transcripts so that we can start to see, are there legal issues that they could then be referring out or pulling volunteer lawyers into. And I think this is a really robust, as there are these more chat lines and text-based services, that we can think about legal connections to them.
All right, and we got a question way back here.
Right on. I'm Greg Bloom with the Open Referral Initiative. This has been really cool to hear. A couple of years ago, I heard you all talking about this project, and I definitely had some concerns. And it seems like a lot of concerns that were coming up for me back then seem to be addressed, right? This is an effort to build something new that will be backwards compatible with other taxonomies in the past, and it's being done in a public forum that people can participate in and give shape to. It's not being designed to remove humans from the loop, but actually to inform people's own decision making. So all that sounds really great. No, not really. It's also really cool to hear you think about terms of service. I don't have comments on the terms of service. I have questions about like, what is the ownership structure of this knowledge that you're accumulating? Who owns that data? Is that specified? If not, have you thought about how to design the ownership of the data? And without commenting on the specific terms of service, you might consider like a trust model for the vehicle that can steward these assets in a way that's accountable and democratic.
Margaret, do you want to talk maybe about the data consortium idea? Or?
Yes, so I'll take the second part. I think there's two questions there, one about ownership and then one about kind of possible models for representing kind of public interest or other things. Feel free to add on if there's more. So for this kind of second question, this idea of a data commons, if not a data trust, has been floated around, and I think there was just a NSF grant that was granted to Georgetown University, a combination of the law school and their other massive data institute, that's the actual name of their data institute, to start exploring a data commons structure for civil justice data sets, whether it's from courts, legal aid, online repositories. So thinking about governance issues, about how we can start to pool data, if most times when data is exchanged, it's between two actors, like Suffolk University and a given nonprofit, or Stanford and Empower Work. How do we start to get data sets that we can have a common structure and more governance about who can access them, who owns it, where that labeled data, that more precious kind of data actually exists. One model, I don't know if you've heard about it, is this idea, very lawyerly, of a data trust. It's actually become more prominent. Has anyone heard of the Sidewalks Lab project in Toronto? Any of the Canadians? Where an Alphabet/Google led project is putting all of the smart city infrastructure into the Metro Toronto areas, and going to be gathering huge amounts of data from people on the street, from people in the city. And there's a huge question about who owns that data or who's stewarding public interest in this massive commercial civic project. And so this idea of a data trust has really been growing up. It's not very well defined, but the basic thrust of it is that there should be a legal document, if not a trustee, who is responsible for managing the community benefit of all of this data that's being gathered and labeled, and that it shouldn't just go necessarily to a single actor who might have been in at the beginning, a la Google or another commercial or nonprofit entity, but really making sure that there is public benefit from this kind of data collection. Also with the genomics projects, this data trust model has also been coming up. If we're gathering large amounts of health data, how do we make sure that the people, the public whose data has been contributed, are benefiting? Also, it's trying to balance out this notion that people aren't really giving very informed consent when they're clicking, yes, sure, you can share my data with Spot or with commercial actors, that there would be a trustee or some document that would be protecting people's data from misuse. All of those are really abstract and hard things to talk about, things that we need a robust group of stakeholders involved in, but clearly there's some funding, there's some energy around commons and governance. So if you are interested in that, I think there will be more networked events to get more contributions into setting something up. But look at Georgetown, I think, especially.
And then to answer the first part about the terms of service, that's this conversation that we're engaging in now. To give you an idea of time horizon, we're hoping to have that sort of stuff for Spot, at least, done by the end of this calendar year. So the expectation is that Spot will be in a good place to have something there. If you go there now, the terms of service are very placeholdery, and right now they do just say nonprofit because they're very placeholdery, and no one would want to actually use Spot's not good enough right yet for a lot of uses. But we want to change that, and I want to be very clear because I feel bad about signaling out profit, nonprofit. That's where our funding is to make it free. If a for-profit wants to do this, that's a conversation we can definitely have. It's just that then it's one of those awkward money conversations. I don't like money. I've been like a government service or nonprofit or something. I like other people who have money who do nice things. I love Nicole. So yeah, okay. There was a question.
David, sorry,
Yes.
just to build off the terms of service too. As we develop this for Spot, we don't, and we go public with what we've developed from there. We don't expect that to be the end of the conversation. We expect the community who's engaging with that tool to tell us where we're making mistakes, where we're doing things that are good. Like, we want that sort of feedback along the way. We don't want to just create something and say, there it is, everyone follow along. We are looking for that engagement.
Another question?
Hey, thank you, David. This is Toma, officer, community lawyer. I think this is a question for you, because I think you have the most experience in this. We're talking about ultimately a text field you can put on your website that you can instruct folks to type into, and they'll receive information back. I saw the context it was put in, and the Suffolk website was what seems to be the problem, ? And I was just wondering what you're finding as being the best way to present that to the end user to make it engaging and produce good questions.
So right now, a lot of that's based upon the sources of our training data. So what we're trying to do is replicate the environment that you're asking. The use case should be as close to the training data we have. So the training data we're looking at is as we've discussed, people just saying, like, this is generally what's going on with me. So actually, Spot performs best when it acts not as like a single line of search, like where someone just types in housing or blah, blah. It really wants like a couple sentences. It says what's going on, because that's how it's going to get the context. So ideally, the sort of mean number, so if you think about our data sets, the Reddit data set, the mean number of words in a question is actually a little over 100 words. I think maybe 150, 170, somewhere around there. So that's what it's being trained on. So obviously the thing it's trained on is where it's going to behave best. That being said, as we're getting new data sources in that have sort of different paradigms, we're training on that too. And so, yeah. So the question is what works best. That's also one of the things we're looking at. And I want to come back to like the Massachusetts design of their portal, where they're using Spot as one of several things to surface what might be an issue. Because what you can do there is, if Spot's going to not perform well in whatever area, but you can find it some other way, however that is, if you can then get that information back to Spot, then we can use that to train. And actually, this is one of the things where something we haven't spoken about, but that I want to, and if actually there's someone here that is in a position to help, I would like to be able to find non-English data sources, because this is all trained on people asking their problems in English. And so one of the possible sources for that would be if you have portals or a project that's going to use Spot and you have content on your website in multiple languages, they can type into Spot in whatever language they're speaking in, and if it's not English, they're not going to get the result's going to say, I don't know what's going on. But if you have some other means, whatever that is, of figuring out what they actually wanted, then they can identify that, and that information can go back to Spot. And then we can segregate out the different language that we've gotten in, and then we can use that as a training set to start training a different language model. There are some other things we could do to approach different languages, and I think it's an empirical question as to how well they would work. I don't want to just translate all of the Spot text because it's not in the voice of the user, and so there might be idiomatic things, stuff we're missing with different populations. But if anyone has data sets like that or could prospectively have access, that's something I'd really be interested in.
Hi. For legal content providers who are using NISME 1, when in the development of NISME 2, or when do you anticipate we should be mapping from our taxonomy from 1 to 2?
So this is just the sequencing, and I think so for the parent and child level 1, high level and subset category. If it's a priority for you, we can try to make it a priority for us. So I think especially the classifier, David will be making a new push on it after this wonderful set of volunteering among everyone here. We expect the classifier to be growing in accuracy over the next few weeks. So we'll make a first pass on how we might do that mapping. You mean in total, our finalized term list is around 250 right now. So it's just me training some RAs to do it. But yeah, if you want it to be prioritized, we can get those issues. It's really the sub-issues at the child level 3 or 4 that are much more detailed and scenario-oriented that are going to take longer. And we also need to introduce those on Learned Hands to get the classifier knowledgeable. But especially for those first levels, I think we could make that a priority if you'd like.
And also, it's not an all or nothing, right? So if you want to integrate Spot now into your development cycle and you're building something in development, you can start using the NISME code. You have just a mapping that goes from the NISME codes to what you have. And when it doesn't map, it doesn't map. But there's nothing to stop you from start doing that process now.
Claire Johnson-Raba. I teach in the Consumer Law Clinic at the University of California, Irvine. So my question is, the existing taxonomies are built through the filter of like legal aid attorneys and human intake workers. And so I'm wondering what effect it would have on like the database and the system to also consider the narratives that the intake workers put into case management systems. And of course that opens a whole can of worms with whether or not you can appropriately anonymize that data in any way to make it functional and available at the level that you guys need it, without taking into the consideration the consent of every individual client who's ever interacted with the legal aid office. But I think it would be valuable to take in those data sets in some way, and I'm wondering if you thought about that or have any ideas on solutions to those problems of privacy.
So I actually haven't seen case intake notes, so I don't know how comparable, I mean, if it would be a new training from beginning, or if it's written in such a different way, or with a different kind of jargon that would have to be like start more from scratch kind of training. I don't know if Ivy Ashton is here or the legal server folks. Ivy's not here. Because I think they did have a project in Florida called Smart Intake. I don't know if Melissa Moss is here who is involved. Anyone here who is involved in the Smart Intake project in Florida? Because they, as legal server, the case management system, they did have access to the case notes, and they were working on a similar classifier oriented around screening intake notes in an intelligent way akin to Learned Hands. But I don't know the status of their project. Obviously, they're more of a commercial entity, so I'm not sure about how well we could integrate that. We don't have access to those intake notes. I'm guessing that's a harder ask to think about. accessing for this project, but.
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to what do they look like? Do they resemble sort of the phrasing that we have now, or are you doing all the things like when I used to practice, where it's a collection of just initials and shorthand that only that office knows? And so the latter would be probably not very useful. The other one could very potentially be useful, especially as it might relate to if those were the notes, say, at a social service intake as well, and that it could help do these things of surfacing. One of the things we're interested in doing with the terms of service and all of that is maybe thinking about language that might go in your retainer, right, as something that you could do too. So prospectively, you can address the question of the data sharing. And that will really be in relationship to sharing with entities based upon what values you're trying to adhere to with that use case, right? Is this confidential data? Is this, what level of protection do you want around this data, and what does that mean for what you can share? I want to, just because I see Nicole there, I want to say there's also, I want to make explicit something that to some extent the AI stuff is a Trojan horse for NISME. Right? So the benefit of us all being able to have the same language to talk about things is really, I think, transformative. So the ability to deep link into each other's resources, because you know that this is a code whatever, I think is the power that will unleash, I think is really hard to underestimate. But it's hard to coordination problems, blah, 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 standards. But here's a cool tool that will do something for you. But the benefit is also that now, once you label all your stuff in a new, with a new label, or make the mapping to your idiosyncratic label, then you can make translations between what other people are doing. And I think that's going to be really powerful. So I don't want people to lose track of that. And then I also just want to say, even though I said it before, it doesn't always have to be portals, right? There are other ways, anytime you might want to have text. I think we got 4 minutes left, so I'm enjoying this conversation. Where did I overshoot? I overshot.
Thanks. I'm from Minnesota, and I'm wondering if you all are seeing any regional differences in how people are using language or the kinds of things that they're looking for. I was just in a session where folks from Texas were saying they get a lot of queries about gun rights. In Minnesota, we don't get as many of those. And also different ways that people describe things, either because of just colloquialisms or because benefits are called different things in different states.
So the short answer is no, but this is really rich. I mean, thinking about Bill Jones and the ABA, the Free Legal Answers platform is very well marked in terms of what jurisdiction, what state people are coming from, if not the zip code. And I think the ABA is also very interested in this kind of new way of doing legal needs analysis to complement the wonderful surveys that LSC and Becky Sandifer and other folks have done, where they survey through statistical sampling of what people's needs are, that we could look at, let's say, Texas's Free Legal Answers activity and see, at least for that platform and the users on that who are all low income, what are the most common legal issue areas? If not, what the language differences are. We haven't dug into that, but yeah, that's very interesting as we get more jurisdiction marked things. Like Reddit's a little bit harder, it's not always jurisdiction marked, but, and especially as we have distinct, if we had Texas Law Help Portal's intake line to see those trends.
I don't think my short answer no would be as hard. I would say that to the lack that we're seeing it is in the Reddit data, that's because of the nature of that data. But when we talk to experts in different areas, there's the experience that you have. And so that's actually one of the reasons, the motivations behind the push to be collecting actual user data from the APIs, because there is going to be that idiomatic difference. And those are the idiomatic differences of things I really are concerned about. You could imagine different distributions of population questions. But as long as everyone asked about guns rights questions in the same way, it doesn't matter if here it's 50% and here it's 2%. The idiomatic difference. And there is a very well understood issue of semantic shift, which is that people will change over time how they talk about issues. And so that's actually another one of the important reasons for having this continuous feedback, because you can then adapt to that. I mean, it may be that in don't know, in 6 months, OK Boomer indicates some type of job discrimination. I don't know. So those are things, that's why that feedback loop is very important. So yeah, I mean, so the answer is always more data, share, and then it's like, well, why? And then it's like trust, and then it's the value proposition is it improves things for the community. And so if you're like, I love the idea of this, but I'm anxious about this, tell us what you're anxious about so we can figure out how to address it. Because the sharing, it really is like, this is like classic, like communal, everyone working together, like let's build stuff that's, I don't know, I'm a little idealistic.
If anyone had 3 dad jokes for David Colarusso in the bingo game, just
I can do a 4th if you need to complete the square.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It's been really fascinating. My name's Andrea Perry-Peterson and I'm from Australia. My question is more of a practical one. How long is this project going for? But also, can you talk a little about how you have worked within your own institutions? So are you involving students and how are you involving students? And are they all from the law school or from other disciplines?
So we have, I have a selection of RAs that are right now primarily doing labeling. They also will eventually help with infrastructure and the build. Right now, since it's a labeling task, they're law students. And it's important to understand that the labeling task is actually really well suited to law students because what they're trying to do is spot the legal issues. So we want diversity of how people ask and think about things in the other, but here we're trying to translate it basically into this legal taxonomy. So there the law students, lawyers are ideal. And so I have RAs, and what I do is we have like RAs and they have like a 7-hour, because that's 2 credits for us, work, and then they'll label things. And something that's not clear from the talk we had here, but if you've heard about Learning Hands before, is when we're figuring out how do people's labels actually we decide whether or not they're any good, it's not something as naive as just like we're waiting for 3 people to say, yes, it's there. So any of you who remember from statistics, you got a jar full of marbles, right? And some proportion of them are red and some proportion are blue. And you want to know what's the real proportion of the marbles. Well, that's what we're doing here, except it's not marbles. It's some proportion of our user population would say this issue is present, and some would say it isn't. So we pull out a red marble, and we're like, oh, we saw a red marble. Well, now we think maybe there are more red marbles than blue marbles. That's consistent with what we have. But there are big error bars. So then I pull out a second red marble. And like, oh, wow, I'm starting to feel confident that this is just red, there's more red marbles. And then the error bars shrink. And after a certain amount of time, those error bars shrink to a certain place. And so what we're actually doing is when we label something as finalized, we are 95% sure that more than half of our users would agree that it was present. And so if that's, that might be, red, 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 or it might be red, blue, red, 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 and then you have to hold that out a lot longer. And so that's the idea of sort of efficiently using those people. The thing that's really nice about everyone playing here is I have 5 RAs. That's usually enough if it's an easy one to trigger. Okay? But then there are these borderlines which need to, if it's not everyone agrees, what do we do? The diversity of people playing today provides a really good punch to the system to come in and add to those. And then finalize a bunch of issues. And so we did this with another conference recently, and they didn't do nearly as much time, but they had this effect because they sort of unlocked that phase change, if you will. So students, labeling, I know Margaret has students too. I could go on forever, but I don't want to, so I'm going to let Margaret. We wrote the API at Suffolk. Another nice thing, since you said Australia, a question might be, what about different jurisdictions? We've been talking with Kate at Justice Connect. They're doing a similar project, so we've been talking so we can share things we've learned. But yeah.
I think we're at time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very happy to talk afterwards if you want to geek out about stuff. Thank you so much for your
We're
attention.
over time. You're so kind.